I want to thank everyone for coming out today. I normally would have started off this press conference with the Watchdog logo on the front, but I didn't. What I wanted to have up here instead is the number $916 million. Rhode Island municipalities, those Rhode Island municipalities and fire districts, have an unfunded pension liability of $916 million just for their fire departments. Nearly $300 million in Providence, down to $1 million for the Valley Falls Fire District, which is in Cumberland. When you add up Cumberland's 4 previous fire districts, the unfunded liability for pensions for firefighters in Cumberland exceeds $5 million. So one of the things that I'm here to talk to you about today is, how did this happen? How did we end up with this specific pension crisis? Because it is a pension. How do these communities make up these liabilities, which in Providence's case is absolutely gigantic? But more importantly, I want to focus today on the town of Johnston's pension. Because in Johnston, you can see they have a $55 million unfunded pension liability. Per capita, that's close to $2,000 for every breathing citizen of the town of Johnston. It's the second highest per capita cost for unfunded firefighter pension liabilities in the state. The worst one is Newport. So how did we get there? How did we end up with such an awful crisis? It's true that too many municipalities did not make their pension payments every year. And we'll talk about the impact of that. But we have a bigger problem beyond that. And that problem is the basic design of these pensions doesn't work. We chose Johnston not only because it had a large unfunded pension liability, we also chose it because it is a graphic example of something called pension spiking. The idea of pension spiking is late in an employee's career, they add things to their salary that are part of the pension calculation that inflates what their starting pension amount is. There's a formula that's used to calculate what the starting pension amount is for an employee. There's a number of things that Johnston puts in to their pension formula that are highly unique. They allow overtime to be calculated as part of the pension formula. They take the clothing allowance. They make that part of the pension formula. And you can see this firefighter played the game dramatically, because this firefighter worked almost no overtime during the bulk of his career. And then in the last 4 years, his overtime exploded. It inflated his starting pension amount by more than $14,000. And what's really important to this conversation is what that does to the pension math. Because that firefighter puts in 8% of his salary every year towards the pension. With the spiking, the town would have to put in every year to fully fund that pension 34% of salary to make sure that firefighter was paid what he was promised when he retired. Without the pension, without the spiking, the number is 26%. These are dramatic numbers, neither one of which, by the way, is affordable. How many towns could afford to put in 26 to as much as 40% of salary to fully fund one individual's pension every year of their career? Now, I argue that they should be forced to do so, because if you make unsustainable promises, you should have to live with them in the here and now and not just pass them off to sometime in the future. But that's the game that we've been involved with here for decades. We've known for decades the pension math doesn't work, and for decades municipalities and the state have been underfunding what they put in for the pension. The problem when you do that is you don't get the compounded interest all the way through a firefighter's career. This firefighter put in $92,000 over the course of his 21-year career towards his pension. $92,000. At 6.5% compounded annual interest, that comes out to $160,000 at the end of his career that he put in towards his pension. With a 1% compounding COLA and a 30-year retirement, which is not unusual, he retired in his early 50s, he draws $2.2 million. He put in 92, and he will draw $2.2 million. To fully fund that pension, the town of Johnston would have had to contribute over the course of his career more than $800,000 to make that pension math work, and I can assure you they put in far less than that. Hence, the dramatic unfunded pension liability of $55 million. Is everyone okay with the definition of spiking before I move on to the next topic? Because this is one of the clearest examples of spiking that we've bumped into so far. I don't know if I've ever produced we produced a lot of graphs. I don't know if we've ever produced a graph with more information jammed onto it than this one. We ran some numbers. We have some models to look at pension math. And there's a lot of variables that go into whether a pension is affordable or unaffordable. What's the assumed rate of interest, the compounded interest that your investments make? Is it 6.5? Is it 7.5? Is it 8.5? Because for the longest time, Rhode Island State and Rhode Island cities and towns used 8.5% as the number, which was way off because the returns weren't coming. So what we did was, in this graph, the light green bars represent 6.5% interest. The blue bars represent 7.5% assumed interest. On the bottom of both those charts, we have the COLAs that are applied to the pension. 1%, 2%, all the way out to 6%, which is what Providence had for quite some time before Mayor Taveras managed to get that suspended. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. The reason we have two graphs, the top graph assumes a 20-year draw on the pension, and the bottom graph assumes a 30-year draw on the pension. And look at the difference that the 20 versus 30-year draws makes. At 6% compounding COLAs, the 20-year draw is a $1.6 million pension benefit. At 30 years, it's a $3.1 million pension benefit. At a 6% compounding COLA, a retiree quadruples their pension in 24 years. It quadruples. Now, modern pension design with 401ks assumes that a retiree needs less money in retirement than they needed during their working career. But the model here is all upside down with these compounding COLAs. Or in the case of the Johnston firefighters, where they often retire with a higher pension amount than their last salary. We have a design problem with the way we're handling our public pensions. And it's serious because it amounts to billions and billions of dollars here in our state. And the best way to quantify it is to force everybody to fully fund those pensions during the working career of the employee. That's what this graph shows you. How much money does the city or town have to put in to properly account for the size of the benefit in retirement? Anywhere from 24% up to 40% with a 20-year draw. And anywhere from 29% up to 60% with a 30-year draw. Wholly unreasonable. Now, I conducted a little unscientific research this weekend. On social media, I asked people to weigh in and say, how much does your employer kick in? We had more than 50 responses. How much does your employer kick in for pensions? The average was under 5%. I talked about what I do, which is we profit share into the pension plan, usually somewhere between 7% and 15%. And the number of people looking for jobs exploded when I mentioned that. That was considered to be rich, and look at what we're doing here. This is beyond rich. And it's bankrupting us because we can't pay it. This chart uses data that is friendlier to the pension contribution than what the Johnston data was on the previous slide. To do this, we assumed that there was no spiking involved, and we assumed that there was a smooth 4% annual increase in pay, so that what the employee contributed over the course of their career was proportionally the same throughout, as opposed to skewed. Any questions on this? Because this is really dramatic and a very important point that we have to discuss. So the question becomes, what do we do? How do we solve this problem? Because we have, 14 communities on that sheet? I haven't counted them up. 14, 15, 16 communities on this sheet with almost an aggregate unfunded firefighter pension liability of $1 billion. That's just fire, let alone police, let alone municipal employees. The problem is that these plans, as designed, were never affordable. But at the time that they went, everybody knew they could ignore that fact and push the responsibility onto future generations. Future generations of elected officials and future generations of taxpayers. The people who bear the brunt of Johnston's $55 million unfunded pension liability are the children of the firefighters who are collecting those benefits right now, and the children of the elected leaders. We have to do something, and I propose a solution. We need a law passed from our General Assembly that tests the pension plans. And we should deem illegal any pension plan that requires an employer contribution of more than a specific percentage. Pick 20%. Any pension plan that requires a taxpayer contribution of more than 20% should be deemed illegal. Because what we need is protection from ourselves. When reckless politicians make promises like a 6% compounding COLA, which quadruples the pension benefit over 24 years, the thing that we know is we need to be protected from that moving forward. We need help. We need this solution, and I think it's a solid one. Because at the end of the day, yes, cities and towns have to make good on not putting in what the required contributions that they have to make, but we have to make sure that those contributions that are required are affordable in the first place. And we see time and time and time again that they're not. I need to come back to the Johnston pension for just 1 second, and I'm going to change topics. In the formula, there is overtime, there is clothing allowance, there is sick time, there's sick time and vacation time. In this calculation, any accrued sick and vacation benefits that were not used by this firefighter get monetized 3 times during the course of their career. They're paid a bonus for unused sick days the year they don't use them. They're paid a cash bonus for the full amount of those unused days when they retire. They're handed a check. And then they dump the value of that into the pension formula as well. It's truly, and I don't use this word lightly, it's truly outrageous. But beyond that, in Johnston, these retiring firefighters are given a longevity bonus through their retirement. Now, a longevity bonus for municipal and state workers is essentially an incentive bonus to remain employed. It's a cash bonus typically paid annually, somewhere between 5% to 18% of salary. Kicks in after 5 years, and it escalates. When a firefighter retires in Johnston, they are paid a 5.5% longevity bonus through their retirement. That's separate from the pension. It's an incentive bonus essentially to stay alive. This is a contract that nobody can afford. It was reckless. I don't know who made these promises. I don't know how it got to where it got to. But what I know now is that town is in serious financial trouble and they need relief from what they've done to themselves. Switching gears quickly. In our first press conference, we had this slide. This slide is a comparative analysis for what metropolitan Rhode Island costs for fire, that's the eastern half of the state, relative to every other comparable metropolitan area that we could find. We compared Rhode Island to Dallas, to Phoenix, to Miami-Dade County, to Prince George's County in Maryland. We could not find a comparable place with the population and square mileage of Rhode Island to Rhode Island's cost. We could not find a more expensive place. And in fact, Rhode Island was anywhere from 1/3 to 100% more expensive than any of these other places. Rhode Island had more fire stations and more fire engines than Dallas and Phoenix combined. And the combined populations of Dallas and Phoenix is near triple to Rhode Island's population. What drives this cost? We didn't really get into that last time. The last time was about just talking about what the cost was. But there's not a more timely conversation for us to have about what drives this cost than right now. Because the town of North Kingstown and a couple other jurisdictions in this state are actively engaged in moving their firefighter shift scheduling from something called a 4-platoon system to a 3-platoon system. And without getting into all of the nitty-gritty behind it, I felt it was very important for Watchdog to weigh in on this particular issue because this issue drives, to a very large extent, the increased cost of fire protection in Rhode Island relative to these other places. Now that's a bold statement, but I stand by it. I'm going to give you the data for why that is. The vast majority of fire departments in the United States use the 4-platoon shift system. No, strike that. Let me start that again. The vast majority, I get a redo. The vast majority of fire departments, 2/3 of them, use the 3-platoon shift system. The majority of fire departments in Rhode Island use the 4-platoon system. And what North Kingstown has taught us is that that move from 4 to 3 is a 30% cost savings. 30%. That is one of the major cost drivers outside of consolidation for why Rhode Island's cost is substantially higher. And there are bills pending in our legislature today to make it nearly impossible for our local fire departments to make this kind of shift change. And I urge our elected officials to pay heed to this data. 67% of fire departments in this country use a 3-platoon system. And I think that they owe everybody an explanation on why they believe they should lock us into a 4-platoon system. Whenever Rhode Island does things differently than the rest of the country, we have to pay heed, and in this particular instance, it's crucially important. I'm going to wrap up with just one last piece of information that I think is a crucially important one. As we were talking to mayors and town managers, and we spoke to a lot of them. In fact, we spoke extensively to Mayor Policino about his situation in Johnston. a clear and very, very crystal clear pattern emerged from every one of those conversations. Every one of those managers of municipal functions told us that they believe that the binding arbitration system is skewed, that the process yields results that are oftentimes not advantageous to the municipality. And the reason that they all provided for it was that the process itself is skewed because labor and the municipality have the option of rejecting specific arbiters. And what happens is if an arbiter decides against labor in one circumstance, the claim is that that arbiter is never hired by any other union to arbitrate. That's the claim. We at Watchdog believe that this is a crucially important issue to quantify. So one of the next things that we're going to look at is we're going to attempt to prove or disprove that claim. Our next press conference, assuming we can get access to the data that we need, will quantify whether the binding arbitration process is skewed, and that if arbiters who find for a municipality are in fact blacklisted and not able to work for any other arbitration in this state. And if we prove that it is skewed, then we must take action to fix it, because clearly what we're seeing here is that contractually we're doing some things that are absolutely unaffordable. So at that, I'm going to shut down the presentation. I'll take any questions that you have. Yes, sir.
Ken, in all this, have you factored in, I'm going to back up a little bit, given the fact that these people retire based on most of us who work for a living, they're still kids when they retire, do you factor in retirement health benefits?
We haven't touched OPEB.
I mean, that's millions. A person retiring at 40, that's over $250,000 per person.
OPEB is dollar-wise probably a larger problem than the pensions. It's a much more difficult one to quantify. It's in our, we have it on our radar, but we haven't dove into it at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Fred Kavanaugh. Couple of questions. You just got done saying that Mayor Palestino up in Johnston was talking, he knows about the situation, correct?
He does.
Why did you just sign a 5-year contract with the city of Johnston with the firefighters? Are you aware of that?
Our conversation with the mayor focused exclusively on the provisions of the contract. We wanted to vet our understanding of his contracts with him, and he gave us an extraordinarily colorful explanation of the binding arbitration process.
But you wasn't aware, you didn't really push them and say, when was the last time you negotiated a contract with these guys?
No, well, you have to remember that where binding arbitration is involved, to a very large extent, the ability of town managers to force an issue is truncated and oftentimes eliminated, right? So it's really the arbitrator holds the keys to the town treasury,
Right.
essentially,
Right.
in these things. So a contract will come, whether or not a manager wants to sign it or not, with binding arbitration the way it works right now.
But they did get a 5-year contract.
Right.
It's already done.
Right.
And you are aware of that, Mayor Palestino has not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pensions coming in. Are you aware of that?
I was not aware of that.
Okay.
So.
Well, you should go check on that also. And there's one other question, because I'm in the financial markets. I've been playing the stock market since '95. So when it comes to numbers, your numbers are right on there. But let me tell you something. You asked to say, well, we gotta get on to the General Assembly and see if we can change them. That's like breaking a wall.
Mhm.
That's not gonna happen. So we do have an elected official that we could ask. That's our general treasurer. He took an oath. And I think that we have some serious problems just with our fire. You haven't even looked at the police.
Correct.
You haven't even looked at you haven't even looked at the judges.
Correct.
So this is a fabulous presentation. And for me to walk away from the market to come down here, we got problems, because let me tell you something. It's just like the banks. and I'm not trying to take your presentation away. They can go, knock on the door, give them the 0% money. It's been years.
Yeah.
They're lucky the market's been this strong, because if not, these numbers would be a
Right.
lot weaker.
Well, so, you bring up an interesting point. MERS, the state retirement plan, assumes a 7.5% rate of return, and I believe they have underperformed that number the last 3 years in a row. So, picking what the return is on the investments is crucially important, and when it doesn't pan out, it has an awful consequence for all of us. So whether it's a 6.5%, a 7.5%, or 8.5% rate of return, very important to the pension design and the assumptions. Is it a 20-year retirement or a 30-year retirement? I think one of the things we have to look at is reducing the number of years that we allow retirees to draw on, obviously, because the difference is, in the case of the compounding 6% COLA, $1.5 million versus more than $3 million, that extra 10 years of draw. And by the way, Providence got rid of their 6% COLA, and about a decade from now, a 3% compounding COLA is going to be instituted instead. That's not affordable either.
And there's just one follow-up on that also. If the firefighter does, God forbid, passes away, is what also carries on, gets that pension, correct?
Correct.
You did not say that.
Yeah, we didn't, again, very difficult to quantify that. We didn't ask for that information in the open records request that we made, but you're absolutely right. There is some form of survivor's benefits. We haven't quantified them in any way, shape, or form. Do you have any questions at all?
Oh, right, yeah, George.
Okay, Mike?
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe GASB, you look at, obviously, the lower the assumed interest rate, the higher the unfunded liability. I believe new GASB rules kick in a couple of months, which could explode these numbers. Have you looked at that part of it? They're going to require municipalities to use a more market-based rate, which is going to be significantly lower, I believe, than 6.5%. So these numbers themselves, even the high numbers, could be very conservative.
There's no question. We decided, just because there's so much data that we threw out here, to just use two interest rates to show you what the crazy difference is just between 6.5% and 7.5%. So, we didn't want to do a full actuarial study and overwhelm everybody with numbers. We could have, but we wanted to keep it relatively simple. Roland.
You touched on the 3-man and 4-man teams.
3 platoon and 4 platoon, that's
3
different.
platoon
That's a
and
number
4
of different
platoon,
shifts.
yeah. As you were talking about that, it reminded me of Charlie Lombardi when he closed one of the fire stations in North Providence on Branch Avenue. In your research, you compared like Rhode Island to Dallas and Phoenix combined. If you were to map out where the stations are, does Rhode Island look congested compared to Dallas and Phoenix?
Yeah. Crazily so. We have a graph on our website that shows you where every fire station is plotted in the state. And Mayor Lombardi actually went on the radio and talked about the fact how he has a fire station that's within hundreds of yards of 2 different fire stations in 2 different communities.
Yeah.
Pawtucket and Lincoln.
So with that, I'm going to end the watchdog portion of this press conference.